Friends, the world has been a whirlwind of activity lately, and we've got a lot to unpack. So let's dive right in and take a closer look at some of the major events that have been making headlines and shaping our current world landscape. Russia's conflict in Ukraine continues to be a massive, drawn-out affair. The primary factor fueling this protracted struggle is the staggering number of Russian military casualties. According to intelligence reports from the United Kingdom, those losses have surpassed 700,000. This horrifying figure encompasses not just soldiers killed in action, but also those wounded, who have deserted, and those who have surrendered. This grim reality has sent the Kremlin into a frenzy, with Russian President Vladimir Putin even seeking assistance from North Korea to offset the immense losses within his army. As many know, the Pyongyang regime dispatched nearly 12,000 troops to the Ukrainian theater, including 1,500 Special Forces personnel for Russia. These additional North Korean forces, inclusive of their Storm Corps, have so far failed to deliver the desired outcomes. In fact, the Storm Corps endured almost 1,000 casualties after a Ukrainian airstrike in the Ukrainian war zone. The latest statistics for North Korean soldiers fighting for Russia in the area indicate that casualties have exceeded 3,000. This has undoubtedly exacerbated the grim mood of Mr. Putin. Neither his own army nor the North Korean reinforcements are making any progress. And what's more, military efforts in the war zone have still not been completely suppressed. Remember to subscribe to our channel, give us a like and turn on notifications. This is very important for our channel. Also, share in the comments where you are watching this video from. It is interesting for us to know our audience. Be sure to watch this video to the end. There will be conclusions at the end. In the aftermath, Russian President Vladimir Putin has gone back on his decision to mobilize, which he launched on September 21st, 2022. Historical mobilizations have been conducted in the Russian Empire during the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and at the onset of the First World War in 1914. In the Second World War, the Soviet Union mobilized its population and industry following the German invasion in 1941. Putin broke new ground when he announced that he would launch a new wave of mobilization in the 21st century, mobilizing 300,000 people for the army. Interestingly, the Russian leader's military strategy is eerily similar to past actions. This time, the Russian regime is aiming to dispatch 300,000 volunteer soldiers to the war in Ukraine. Yes, you heard it right. Putin has made the critical decision to repeat the mistake he committed back in 2022. He has announced that he will send 300,000 of his soldiers into the very center of the line of fire. What kind of catastrophe will this unbelievable situation, likened to a second wave of mobilization in Russia, plunge the country into? What does Putin intend to achieve by recruiting 300,000 additional volunteer soldiers following the first mobilization attempt, and after having additional soldiers from North Korea fight in the Ukrainian war zone? Will this new conscription method cause the Russian army to completely collapse? Is the Russian army not in a state of collapse already? We'll be tackling all these critical questions together and examining the depths of the situation the war between Ukraine and Russia has thrown Putin into, a blind alley from which he seems unable to escape. We will also explore the potential trajectory the conflict will take in the near future. Let's first take a look at how Russian volunteers will be recruited to join the war in Ukraine. Presumably they will be novice soldiers undergoing short-term training inside Russia. Even Balv, the head of the training department of the Russian armed forces, has not specified when these 300,000 reservists were trained. There are a lot of doubts surrounding this, but the Russian military leadership claims they were trained in 2024. Former Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu established 9 reserve battalions to train and prepare contract soldiers to make up for Russia's losses in Ukraine by the end of 2023. According to Shoigu, 335,000 people volunteered to fight in 2023. Russia has experienced a record number of losses in terms of military equipment and personnel in the conflict against Ukraine. In November, Moscow's losses had steadily increased since early autumn, as Russia continued its advance in the Donetsk region with the objective of capturing the towns of Pokrov and Kurakov. In November alone, more than 45,000 Russian soldiers were either wounded, eliminated, or captured. As a result, the Kremlin was unable to continue participation in operations. Former President Dmitry Medvedev, for his part, claimed that the number of volunteers for military service had intensified in the wake of these heavy losses. In September 2024, President Putin increased the size of the army to 1.5 million active duty soldiers, with a potential of 2 million reserve soldiers. Russia is currently announcing that it will voluntarily send 300,000 of its currently serving soldiers to Ukraine. The Russian Defense Ministry has already verified that more than 300,000 soldiers have recently signed voluntary contracts to take part in the conflict in Ukraine, which the Kremlin and the state media describe as a special military operation in Ukraine. While it is unclear whether these soldiers have been trained and whether they will voluntarily join the war fronts, the Kremlin's action emphasizes a significant shift in Russia's military approach. Heavily relying on volunteer soldiers instead of a large-scale conscription is a clear sign that the Kremlin's military structure is in a state of disrepair. Even Balv, head of the Combat Training Directorate of the Russian Armed Forces, has asserted that the creation of reserve regiments designed specifically for this purpose had been successful. However, it appears improbable that a professional army can be substituted with 300,000 reluctant but volunteer battalions. This is because these regiments are typically new recruits, willing to serve for a defined period of time under contract, providing an alternative to compulsory military service. Put another way, volunteer military elements can only escalate the casualty figures of the Russian army, since they will not receive sufficient training in warfare. Despite the prospect of higher casualty rates, this volunteer force is increasingly becoming an integral part of Russia's military strategy. It enables the Russian government to mobilize additional forces for the ongoing war in Ukraine, without resorting to mass conscription, which could be seen as a politically problematic action. Volunteer service contracts typically come with requirements regarding salary, benefits, and the duration of the soldier's commitment. The government's reliance on these contracts reflects a broader trend in the Russian military, a trend aiming to strengthen its ranks with individuals who are prepared to fight for compensation instead of facing compulsory service. This is seen as another factor that could potentially doom Russia to military catastrophe rather than success. There are, of course, also doubts about whether these 300,000 soldiers, who will be sent to the war in Ukraine, will actually be deployed to the front lines of their own free will. Given that Russia previously launched a similar mobilization campaign and sent even university students to the Ukrainian front lines, it is uncertain whether these 300,000 volunteer troops will face similar coercion. In particular, the number of military casualties within the army and the lack of basic humanitarian conditions on the front lines are likely to diminish the inclination of Russian soldiers to participate in the conflict in Ukraine. However, Putin will undoubtedly figure out how to build up this military reserve in spite of all these problems. Even if this additional military force does materialize, it will probably be difficult for Russian commanders to maintain additional reserve forces on the front lines. The impact of the war on morale, coupled with the lack of a clear end in sight for Russia, makes it difficult for commanders to keep their forces intact. The Kremlin is also attempting to replace soldiers who have fled the front lines, as well as troops who have been eliminated or wounded, with an army of 300,000 volunteers. Russian military authorities, while recognizing the issue of desertion, are constantly seeking punitive measures. However, they are frequently aware of the psychological stress their soldiers face. These penalties can even result in death or extremely severe prison sentences. No soldier wants to be on a battlefield under these kinds of punishments. In fact, Russia has already tried a similar plan to deploy additional troops. If you remember, the Wagner Group fought extensively on the eastern front lines with the aim of making Putin's invasion attempts in Ukraine successful. But recall how that turned out. The Wagner leader, who lost his life, tried to organize a rebellion against the regime in Moscow, rising up against the lack of resources provided by the Russian army. Although this revolt was unsuccessful, Russia's plans to provide additional troops led to very risky and hazardous situations. As we can see, Putin has not learned from those kinds of setbacks. Vladimir Putin is still promoting the concept of deploying additional troops in the war in Ukraine. This notion could signify the end of his rule. If the additional volunteer soldiers join the conflict in Ukraine and the Russian army's casualties become much higher, Putin could face significant problems suppressing dissenting opinions within the government. As the war drags on, these problems intensify, pushing one side closer to a tipping point where the continuation of the war worsens its own position. On the other hand, military production and the ability to compensate for losses are among the tangible elements of war that can be calculated and accurately anticipated. Russia's list of losses in military resources is pretty large, as are its troop casualty figures. Russia's strategy to manufacture 149 T-90M tanks by 2024 was one of the most important escape routes for Putin this year. Russia lost approximately 47 T-90M tanks. Somehow, the Kremlin had to make up for this shortfall. Russia also relied heavily on substituting older tanks from its Soviet-era stockpile, like the T-72, T-62, and T-55 and 54 models. However, the unforeseen Ukrainian missile and drone assaults disrupted all of Russia's military production plans. It turned out that Russia's supply of T-55s fell by 31%, T-62s by 37%, and T-80Bs by 79%, while only 9% of T-72s were withdrawn from storage. Although these figures were not proven to be precise, they did point towards the fact that Russia's tank reserves were being quickly depleted. While losing a record number of tanks, the Kremlin was incapable of focusing on increasing military production. These numbers far exceeded Russia's current tank production potential. The total loss of nearly 3,300 tanks was the primary factor that demolished Russian military production. Moreover, the collapse of the dynamics of the Russian economy was a significant phenomenon that greatly reduced the power of the army and distracted Putin from his goals. Since the illicit seizure of Ukrainian territory in 2014, it has grown on average by only 1% per year. Russia's GDP has fallen from $2.3 trillion in 2013 to $1.9 trillion in current dollars. As Vladimir Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine approaches its third anniversary, the financial, technological, and demographic obstacles confronting the Russian economy are more severe than are commonly acknowledged. Since 2014, and particularly since 2022, the Russian economy has been subject to severe international sanctions, but assessments of their impact vary greatly. President Vladimir Putin and his supporters maintain that sanctions have made Russia stronger, but they consistently call for the removal of all restrictions. Simultaneously, many contend that the sanctions have had minimal impact, while others argue this is because the sanctions are too light. According to experts, the current sanctions regime cuts 2 to 3% of GDP annually and nearly condemns Russia to stagnation. Moreover, the situation could worsen for Putin and even impede Russia's campaign of aggression against Ukraine for exclusively economic reasons. At the Yalta European Strategy Conference in Kiev, Ukrainian General Kirilo Budanov reported that Ukrainian military intelligence has obtained Russian documents suggesting that the Kremlin wants to sue for peace at the end of 2025 for financial reasons. Whether true or not, this scenario appears plausible to many. The financial, technological, and demographic hurdles confronting the Russian economy are more formidable than generally recognized. And Putin's war has become a part of history. The country has also been significantly impacted by declining energy revenues, which are seen as an important symbol of economic failure. Russia has reduced its reliability as an energy provider. The only sectors of the Russian economy that are showing growth are the military and related infrastructure, where state-owned companies are selling to the state at, most likely, inflated administered prices. The rest of the economy looks stagnant at best. This is a situation that used to occur in the Soviet Union. The fact that the Russian central bank claims that annual inflation is only 99.1%, while the country is facing an interest rate of 19%, is a throwback to the Soviet times. Most probably, the authorities were repackaging inflation as real growth. Hidden inflation also implies that Western financial sanctions have been far more effective than many observers had anticipated. Russia's total external debt has decreased from $729 billion at the end of 2013 to just $33 billion at the end of March 2024, and public debt is only 14% of GDP. However, this does not help Russia much because it cannot borrow from outside. Instead, Putin's country must survive on tax revenues and reserves, and half of its foreign exchange reserves have been frozen in Western jurisdictions since February 2022. Meanwhile, liquid reserves in Russia's National Wealth Fund have fallen from a peak of $183 billion in 2021 to $55 billion, or 2.8% of GDP, as of March 2024, with most of the rest invested in illiquid assets. Due to these constraints, Russia has had to limit its annual budget deficit to 2% of GDP since its full-scale invasion. With a GDP of $1.9 trillion, such deficits cost about $40 billion a year and indicate that state reserves will have to be depleted next year. As noted by Budanov, the main directorate of intelligence of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, although Russia is increasing taxes on personal and corporate income, this will not help much in a stagnant economy, and the government is unlikely to be able to sell many bonds domestically. Including all hidden expenses, Russia could probably spend around $190 billion on the war this year, or 10% of GDP. And given the limitations imposed by Western financial sanctions, this figure could potentially represent a peak. Since Russia can no longer finance a budget deficit, it may be forced to reduce public spending. No longer a superpower, Russia is seen as what the late U.S. Senator John McCain famously called a gas station disguised as a country. Ukrainian intelligence thinks so too. According to its latest reports, the war between Russia and Ukraine could end in late 2025 and early 2026. It appears unlikely that Putin will be able to get out of this situation with the volunteer conscription model. What about the situation in Ukraine? There is a very important topic that has been gaining a lot of attention lately concerning Ukraine. It involves the possibility of deploying European troops or private military contractors to assist Ukraine. This could relieve some of the pressure on Ukrainian forces. The idea of European countries sending troops to Ukraine has become the subject of a major political debate. In particular, French President Emmanuel Macron recently proposed that sending ground troops to Ukraine could be considered, emphasizing that such a move should not be ruled out to prevent a Russian victory. His statements were met with varied reactions across Europe, with many leaders rejecting the idea of directly involving their troops in the conflict. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Defense Minister Boris Pistorius have stated unequivocally that NATO should not send troops to fight Russia in Ukraine. Similarly, the leaders of Spain, Poland, and Sweden have confirmed that they have no plans to send troops, further strengthening the general resistance to direct military involvement in Europe. At the same time, some countries, such as Estonia, have expressed a willingness to consider a deeper military involvement, although they have not yet made a formal commitment. The prospect of NATO's direct involvement remains a sensitive issue, especially given Russia's warnings that such a move could lead to a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia and escalate the conflict to cataclysmic levels. The broader implications of this discussion go beyond troop deployments alone. NATO's involvement, or lack thereof, could determine the future course of the war. For example, a possible NATO ground intervention could shift the strategic balance in favor of Ukraine. But the risk of triggering a larger, more destructive war should not be underestimated. This is a worry that European leaders are anxious about, and which will undoubtedly shape their decisions in the coming months. While European governments have so far committed to support Ukraine primarily through weapons deliveries, training, and monetary aid, the prospect of sending ground troops remains a highly controversial and improbable scenario at the moment. However, the ongoing nature of the war may force European countries to reconsider their stance. Whether NATO will be further drawn into the conflict directly or indirectly depends on several factors, including the military performance of Ukrainian forces, the domestic political environment within NATO countries, and perhaps most crucially, the evolving dynamics of the war itself. This evolving situation raises further questions about the future of international military alliances, the efficacy of volunteer forces in modern warfare, and the psychological and strategic challenges facing soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Depending on volunteer troops, whether they are Russian or future contributors to the Ukrainian cause, is becoming an increasingly vital element of both countries' military strategies. The long-term sustainability of such a model remains uncertain, and the ongoing conflict will likely continue to test the resilience and adaptability of these military forces. But if Europe sends troops to Ukraine, it could make a difference, as these troops are likely to be professional teams. So far, testing on the Ukrainian battlefield has shown that the concept of voluntary conscription has done Russia no favors, and Kiev is looking forward to this type of European military support. The most likely scenario today is that Europe will support Ukraine even more intensively, both militarily and financially. in order to increase the Russian army's casualty rate even further. Therefore, if Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin sends another 300,000 troops into the Ukrainian war, the West could flood the Ukrainian army with aid. The primary aim is to prevent additional Russian troops from turning the war in favor of the Kremlin. So if we see 300,000 volunteer Russian military battalions moving towards the Ukrainian front lines in the future, we may also see a large number of tanks, armored vehicles, and other military resources in the wagons of the aid trains coming from Europe to Ukraine. We are seeing numerous indications that the invasion of Ukraine has plunged Russia into military and economic collapse and created a deep crisis. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. How the Russian nation feels about the war and how it is behaving is hidden in the silent cries within the country. Now let's look at the impacts of the war from a different perspective and contemplate Russia's real problem, which is the citizens fleeing the country. But why would a Russian citizen immigrate from his country? When people lose their desire to live in their country and their loyalty to that nation is completely depleted, the exodus begins. Indeed, from the first day Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin ordered the entry of Russian tanks across the Ukrainian border lines in February 2022, there was significant unease within the country. Russians probably thought that the war might eventually have an impact on them. Furthermore, Russians were perhaps ashamed of their country for declaring war on a country like Ukraine, with which Russia has had brotherly ties for centuries. That is why the first flights from Russia began in the early days of the conflict. Putin has been waging this conflict for almost 3 years, completely ignoring the population decline in his country. But the reason why the country has sunk so low economically and militarily that it will not recover is because Russian citizens have already fled their homeland. It is estimated that more than 1 million Russian citizens have left the country so far due to the effects of the war. In the shadow of the population decline, illegal immigrants in Russia are also being deported because of the war. The Russian leader has prepared a very important decree on this matter. So which migrants does Putin's decree affect? When will the Russian leader send the illegal migrants out of the country? Will these illegal immigrants have a chance to remain in the country? Will Putin use them in the army or in military production? How will Russian citizens currently residing abroad deal with this decree concerning illegal immigrants? Will they return to the country, or will they continue to live away from the effects of the war? And how will all of these situations, expected to be experienced with the last decree mentioned by Putin, put Russia's economy and military internal structure into a difficult situation? We will explore the answers to all these questions together in detail. But before we go into that, please do not forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and leave a like so that you can stay informed about our content. Vladimir Putin has issued a decree that could force large numbers of people to leave the country in 2025, giving illegal immigrants 4 months to gain legal status. On December 31st, the Russian president signed a decree giving those who entered the country illegally until April 30th to undergo health checks, pay debts, and pass exams in the Russian language, history, and law. He also opened the door to the possibility of legal status for the migrants by signing a military contract that would allow them to fight in the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Putin. But if illegal migrants do not comply with the conditions set by the Russian leader, they will be required to leave the country. There are many people in Russia who are concerned by this decree. In Russia, with an OECD population of more than 146 million in 2019, illegal immigrants comprise roughly 7% of the population. In 2021, the Moscow government reported that more than 1 million illegal immigrants from former Soviet countries were living in Russia. This indicates that many more are at risk of deportation under Putin's orders. One of Putin's reasons for signing this decree is the potential that illegal migrants could fill Russia's labor shortage if they satisfy the requirements. The war in Ukraine has aggravated Russia's estimated labor shortage of around 1.5 million people. Due to high casualties, the exodus of skilled workers fleeing military service, and a more restrictive environment. Migrants, mostly illegal immigrants from former Soviet countries in Central Asia, make up a significant part of Russia's economy and work primarily in low-skilled industries. But if the Kremlin forces illegal migrants to leave the country or join the army, Putin's order could add to the turbulence confronting the sanctions-hit Russian economy. So what exactly should illegal migrants who wish to stay do? Those who want to stay will have to have their biometric data recorded and undergo a medical examination, including checks for the use of banned substances and the presence of illnesses like HIV. Exemptions are granted to those who have served in the military. However, the exemptions do not apply to migrants who represent a threat to Russia's national security. The Russian Interior Ministry will implement the decree, while the Health Ministry will organize the medical examinations. It is noteworthy that such a decree was issued sometime after an unfortunate attack in Russia. As you may recall, the Russian authorities signaled that they would take significant action on the migration issue after the terrorist attack at the Crocus City Hall concert venue in the Moscow region, which killed 145 people and injured nearly 500 others. The investigation concluded that the perpetrators were from Tajikistan. At the International Economic Forum in St. Petersburg in June, Putin stated that his government needed to address its migration policy, particularly given the need for migrants to solve the labor shortage hampering economic growth. However, in evaluating Putin's latest decree, it appears that the Kremlin is prioritizing Russia's force-building needs and domestic political stability over efforts to ease economic pressure and labor shortages. In the new year, we have already mentioned that Putin's decree states that illegal migrants must leave the Russian Federation independently or determine their legal status between January 1st and April 20th. However, there are significant doubts that these legal procedures will be properly implemented, possibly because illegal migrants are joining the army. Experts say that Putin's decree could become more flexible if a significant number of migrants working in food services, transportation, and other low-skilled industries leave Russia or are forced to join the Russian army. However, this would exacerbate Russia's ongoing labor shortage. Since the vast majority of illegal migrants are more likely to be integrated into the Russian army, the country's labor shortage will most likely take a back seat. But will Putin's decree on illegal migrants be strictly enforced? Economists say it remains to be seen whether the decree will be implemented, and much depends on whether labor market challenges are more important to the Kremlin than political pressure to deport migrants. The Washington, D.C.-based think tank said the decree implementation would indicate that the Kremlin is prioritizing appeasing aggressive ultra-nationalists and security issues linked to reports of migrants committing crimes and acts of terrorism over economic issues. As you know, illegal immigrants connected to such crimes are anticipated to be deported from the country by Vladimir Putin's decision, but they are more likely to be recruited into the Russian army. Putin may create a new Wagner criminal organization within the Russian army. This could cause Russia to face enormous problems regarding the invasion of Ukraine. Remember what happened after Putin deployed Wagner mercenaries on the war fronts? A second Wagner case would be a tremendous disappointment for Putin and could seriously undermine his power. Of course, if such a decree is not implemented in a transparent manner and transforms into a dangerous method to meet the army's recruitment needs, i.e., if illegal immigrants and those with criminal connections are recruited into the Russian armed forces, then Russians in the country can be expected to start planning their escape plans again. Because no one wants illegal immigrants, criminals, or people who use banned substances in their country. And given that Russia is accustomed to this wave of migration, how Putin's decree on illegal immigrants unfolds could have a profound impact on the future of the country's population. There have been two distinct waves of migration from Russia, the first in the spring and summer of 2022, and the second after the announcement of partial mobilization in September 2022. Since then, a considerable number of Russian immigrants have returned to Russia, and an estimated 650,000 people are still abroad. Countries such as Tajikistan, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkey are among the top destinations where Russian citizens choose to live. But would these Russian migrants return to the country if Putin's decision on illegal migrants is implemented in accordance with the law, and if he ensures that those with criminal links or those associated with banned substances leave Russia? Conclusion. We have reached the end of our review of world events today. Let's analyze them. Firstly, it is clear that Russia's military operations in Ukraine have led to a significant decrease in both its military and economic power. The high number of casualties, the mobilization of additional volunteer forces, and the reliance on troops from North Korea have not led to a reversal of the trend, and the Russian army is facing considerable difficulty. Secondly, European nations' support for Ukraine including the potential deployment of troops or private military contractors, is an important factor that may significantly influence the outcome of the war. The debate on military involvement indicates a complex political landscape and the challenges of balancing the desire to support Ukraine and the risk of escalating the conflict. Finally, Russia's internal situation is marked by population decline and the emigration of its citizens due to the war. Putin's decree on illegal migrants may further exacerbate the internal issues faced by the state, as the enforcement of such a policy may lead to further migration and economic difficulties for the country. These complex events demonstrate that the world is in a period of great change, and it is important to constantly monitor the changes and be informed. Thank you for being with our channel. Write in the comments where you are watching us from and put a like, as well as subscribe if you have not already done so.